So plant breeding started a long time ago. It started with prehistoric man. When prehistoric man decided to select one plant in preference to another, that's how plant breeding began. A plant breeder is a person involved in the genetic improvement of crop plants. They use knowledge from genetics to improve aspects of a plant that increases economic value of that plant. Normally seek to improve the economic value of the crop in which they work. So,
I mean, it's important to know that, especially in the U.S., you know, agriculture is an important, I mean, we feed the world, we feed the nation, you know, we feed our local population. And so, you know, we farm intensively. And so we're always faced with high cost, new diseases, new insect pests. And that's where plant breeders come in. When you're breeding new crops and you're doing selection programs, you're trying to, you know, we're trying to breed for disease resistance, insect resistance, and most importantly, trying to increase yield potential. And sugarcane is in Asia, Papua New Guinea. And so some of the early native peoples naturally selected softer, sweeter types of sugarcane. So those were really the true first plant breeders. They also selected some for building construction. These types of varieties had higher fiber content. So you can see, depending on the use, people naturally began to select out different types of sugarcane. And then as the age of science increased, we just began applying more scientific principles to essentially the same thing that these native peoples were doing.
So essentially, plant breeding has evolved over the years because today we use more information to carry out our plant breeding programs. For example, early man relied solely on phenotypic. They did not evaluate the plant, they just evaluated it by looking at it and deciding that this was a better plant, and they selected it. Today we have more information about the genetics of the plant. We know, for example, that a trait is controlled by genetics, and we know the extent to which a particular trait is controlled by genetics, and we use that information to select the plant. We also have new tools like biotechnology and molecular markers that we bring to the table that helps us make more informed decisions as we go about our selection program.
I remember when I was in school, they always talked about plant breeding as being both an art and a science. And so you can say early man probably conducted it more in terms of the art of plant breeding by just taking visual observations, well as, you know, science became more part of plant breeding programs. You know, we began understanding the genetics and environmental components of selection.
Early man used more of the art than the science. And today we use more science, but there's a little bit of art to it because you define what you want to select before you go out and select for it. So that's the art that comes into play when you conduct breeding programs.
So I always had an interest in math and science coming through high school, and it directed my interest in college. I grew up on a farm, so I knew I wanted to have a career in agriculture. I didn't really know what I wanted at the time, but my interest in science and math really served me well for a career in plant breeding. And so with that, we took genetics courses, we took math, basic calculus, and a lot of statistics. A lot of the early statistics were derived by plant breeders because, you know, we deal with complex traits and distributions. So the plant breeding curriculum was a lot of biology, genetics, statistics, and now when you move into some of the more modern techniques, it's a lot of molecular biology.
I grew up in Cameroon, and that's in West Africa. I grew up on an oil palm plantation, and I worked with plant breeders when I was a teenager. My dad took me to meet the plant breeder, and I spent some time with that person, and he really motivated me to see what he was trying to do. When I went to college, I studied botany for my first degree, and then I came back and I asked my dad what he thought I should specialize in. And he made the comment that plant breeders are always needed at the plantation, and each time they hired one, somebody hired them away from the plantation that I should go study plant breeding. So that's how I ended up studying plant breeding. I took a lot of math, statistics, and biology courses. By the time I got finished my PhD, there was a new emerging field called molecular biology, which I had to take. So that's what prepared me to be a plant breeder today.
And having grown up on the farm here in Louisiana, I can always remember when a new variety was introduced onto the farm. The American Sugarcane League would distribute seed cane of new varieties that the breeders would develop. And so when these new varieties were distributed on the farm, they were always eagerly anticipated because people knew that new varieties had a big impact on their farming operations. So I can remember riding around with my dad on the farm trying to learn the identity of new varieties, and I just remember being very proud of the fact that I could drive down the road and name this variety and that variety, and then you could follow them all the way through harvest and see where they had the impact on the bottom line. So that always drove my career choice, that remembering that in grade school and high school.
Yeah, where I grew up to, we had a problem with a disease, with an insect pest called leaf miner, and they flew in an expert all the way from Europe to come work on this insect pest. And while he was working on the pest, he also recommended that they get a new plant breeder to see if they could breed their way out of this problem. And while I was there, I saw them use plant breeding to select a new palm that was tolerant to this pest. So that was really motivating to me.
And they call plant breeding a multidisciplinary effort because you involve geneticists, molecular biologists, plant pathologists for diseases, entomologists for the insect problem. So, really plant breeders are team builders. They're trying to build coalitions to solve problems which have a wide range of effects on a crop. So, a person has to have good team building skills in order to be a plant breeder because they're problem solvers.
And a plant breeder should also have good managerial skills because you manage people as well as budgets. Depending on where you're working, if you're working in a public institution, you have to communicate well, both verbally and in writing. You have to seek a grant, so you have to write grants. You also have to write publications. You have to communicate with your staff. You have to communicate with your colleagues as well as with your subordinates. So communication is very important. Managerial skills are also very important, and you have to be a team builder because you work with plant pathologists, entomologists. Sometimes you have to work with statisticians. If you have a new problem that you're trying to solve that is beyond your means.
Yeah, so there are many breeders in the public system, universities in the land-grant university systems. Sugarcane and rice in Louisiana are good examples of the land-grant mission. There's not a lot of private company involvement in these two crops. Although big in Louisiana, sugarcane and rice are not really big crops nationwide. We have about 3 million acres of rice and maybe 1 million acres of sugarcane. So those growers look to places like LSU, University of Arkansas, to do their sugarcane and rice breeding. So that's conducted at the university level. Crops such as corn and soybeans, where you can have as much as 90 to 100 million acres, there's a lot of private companies out there. So private industry is a big employer of plant breeders.
And the day-to-day function varies depending on whether you're working in the public sector or in the private sector. For example, in the public sector, you would also be responsible for training students who are the future plant breeders. In the private sector, you're just mainly involved in cranking out new varieties.
So what Collins does as a plant breeder at LSU is variety development is certainly, you know, a big objective in the program, and that's important. But you're also interested in the science of the, you know, of plant breeding and improving plant breeding methodologies and practices. So, and that's done a lot through graduate students. We talked about the multidisciplinary aspects of plant breeding. And in sugarcane, I mean, having a really good plant pathologist and entomologist is important. I'll give you an example. We've had a whole host of new diseases that have been introduced into Louisiana since early 1980s. We had brown rust that was introduced in 1979. Sugarcane smut was introduced in 1981. Leaf scald disease was introduced in 1992. Yellow leaf in the late 90s. Orange rust in 2008. And so every time a new disease comes into Louisiana, normally we expect to control that through a plant breeding program. So having a plant pathologist such as Dr. Jeff Hoy is a real asset to our breeding program. The same can be said for the entomologist. We've been battling the sugarcane borer since we've had sugarcane in Louisiana. We have an emerging pest, the Mexican rice borer. It's in the western part of the industry. You know, we have been working with Dr. Gene Reagan, the LSU AgCenter entomologist, for the last 10 years on this emerging pest. So when these pests do arrive, you know, we've had ample time to address them within a plant breeding program. Now, when I was coming up through training at LSU in the early to mid 80s, generally plant breeders were trained with a big statistical background because they came out more as quantitative geneticists. As molecular biology improved over the years and that science developed, people like Collins have a stronger training in molecular biology.
Yeah, molecular biology is a new awesome tool that plant breeders now have in their toolbox that they can use to conduct their breeding programs. The molecular biology is a tool that can be used to interrogate the plant and understand the genetics of the plant better than was possible a couple of years ago. With molecular biology, you can know if a plant has a particular gene or not, even without evaluating that plant out in the field, such that you could screen out tens and thousands of plants in the greenhouse and select those plants that have the gene you're looking for and then plant them out in the field, saving a lot of years and resources that you could have spent evaluating these plants out in the field for several years. And then there's another field within the arena called biotechnology. Biotechnology is a little different from molecular biology in the sense that with biotechnology you can actually identify the gene from another species, clone that gene and insert it into your plant of interest, and then evaluate if that plant expresses that gene, and if that happens, you now have a new trait. For example, they've been able to insert the gene for Roundup resistance into, say, corn, and then now they're able to spray corn with Roundup and kill all the other weeds except the corn plant.
Another good example is cold tolerance in tomatoes. There's a cold tolerance gene that they've inserted to improve cold tolerance in the tomato plant. So there's a wider range of applications for transgenics. I read this in a book about a year ago, and it was from Dr. William Carter Stubbs. He was the first scientist that the LSU AgCenter hired in 1885. And although he was a soils person by training, about 5 years into his career, he says, you know, nothing changed yields on the farm like the application of new varieties. And that really stuck with me. And so I guess that's why I was always excited about a career in plant breeding, because the development of new varieties, there's no greater effect than that on the farm than a career in plant breeding, improving varieties, improving disease resistance, gaining insect resistance, bringing in new technologies such as transgenics, cold tolerance, herbicide resistance, insect resistance. So all of those things can be accomplished through the field of plant breeding. So anyone considering a career in plant breeding has an exciting career ahead.
Yeah, it's been very exciting for me. I mean, there's no greater joy than releasing a variety and going out there and seeing farmers grow this variety, and you know, sometimes they pat you on the back, they invite you out for a beer. When I used to work in Australia, I'll go to a farmer's field and he want to show me what a new variety, how well the new variety was performing, and he invite me over for a meal and a beer, and we'll talk about the variety. I mean, that's the beauty of being a plant breeder.